Well, hello, everybody. Daniel is back once again with an exciting interview with uh, a longtime friend of mine and fellow um, socialist Lacanian or left-wing Lacanian. As folks know, a big focus of our channel, of this podcast, of my study groups, and all of the things that I am obsessed with in the world of thought and practice revolves around the insights of psychoanalysis and furthermore the revolution of the French Freud, this very bombastic figure named Jacques Lacan, and his often esoteric work. And Mark has written a book with the Palgrave Lacan series on Lacan and spiritual direction, and we're gonna talk about that. But I thought, Mark, it would be best so that we can get our bearings straight on this notoriously difficult psychoanalytic philosopher, Jacques Lacan, who he is a psychoanalyst, and he famously says that he gives his seminars for psychoanalysts. But of course, the entire intellectual community is captivated by what Lacan has to say. And Lacan is from as we know from Danny Nobis's two-part interview on the new biography that he's making on Lacan. We know that Lacan had a relationship to Catholicism, even to Jansenist Catholicism interest him. There's a sort of conservative Catholic streak and obsession, I think, that he has in his work. And there's many citations of great theologians that Lacan invokes in his seminars and in his writings. What does Lacan say about religion, though, in the modern period, Mark, that you think is worth that you think is of interest, both to sort of people that are religious, to people that are spiritual, and to people who are not either?
Well, I think the first thing, if we're talking about Lacan and his religion, there's two things. There's his formation and his writings. And I think, he says, it's in his Discourse to Catholics, or he says, I am the product of priests. I am the product of priests. But his main formation, I think, is like if you read, and I think you see in Rudinesco's biography, he says, he was brought up in a sort of provincial, not but a type of Catholicism. Yeah, his Catholicism, he was brought up Catholic. His mum was staunch, but later, as he grew, he was taught by an eminent theologian and philosopher named Jean Baruzzi, who wrote a great work on John of the Cross, which incidentally is being translated by my partner Wan Young, who is going through this. But the point that you see with Lacan, with his writings, if you're going through his seminars, his writings are constantly littered all the way through with references to religion, whether this is from, as you said, sort of Jansenist perspective or Catholic, but at the same time, there's also constant references to mystical writings, and we know this famously with the mystical seminar 20, where he speaks of John of the Cross, he speaks of Teresa Avila, he speaks. Right, you can see there's references running right the way through his writings, and I think we can see it very much in when he's speaking about the non-rapport, how the mystical as such is seen on the side of the not all. But I think what's interesting as well is that I like to make a contrast between, if we're talking about psychoanalytic or therapeutic discourses properly, how we can contrast Lacan's approach to religion with, say, people like Jung or Carl Jung. And you can see this in the Discourse to Catholics, where he's speaking directly to a Catholic audience, and he's berating them for being enamored with the Gnostic writings of Jung. And you can see he's trying to make the case for Catholics to get stuck into his own writings, get stuck into his own theories. So yeah, I mean, we can see right the way through his writings that there was always this constant return to Catholic writings or Catholic theologians. And it would be a mistake to say, oh, well, this means like Lacan is fully, a Catholic, or, he is secretly a theologian, or he's, a full believer, although apparently his brother believes he is, or he was. I don't believe that this is the case. I do believe that he was slightly cynical of the, staunch, dry atheism that was around at the time, and he had a great respect for the Catholic intellectual tradition. But it would be a mistake to say anything like Lacan was a full, true, believing theist of any kind.
Right, because one of the things that Lacan says in a counterintuitive way in one of his later seminars is something about the paradoxical point regarding the unconscious and belief is such that only atheists truly believe, because in short, I mean, you could sort of summarize his point as I understand it. I invite you to comment. It is important. One of the truths of Freudian discovery of the unconscious is the idea that a analyzed individual has cultivated a different relationship to their unconscious, such that they have a type of dupery. They understand that the unconscious, right, that they are not the master in their own home, right? Mm-hmm. And there is therefore a ethical lesson of modesty. And so therefore a kind of fundamentalist, or a sort of a vulgar believer is in some sense false for Lacan. Like, so Lacan therefore develops, and Zizek has written probably 4 or 5 books on this, a different conception of belief. Right. So there's that insight, and folks like Peter Rollins, who is like an actual evangelical Christian, will try to use Lacan's theory of belief to infuse a contemporary understanding, which is a clarification for Christianity regarding its own relationship to atheism. Mm-hmm. So give me a sense, if you would, about your thoughts on Lacan and belief.
Is about this sort of vulgar idea of what belief is. As soon as we ask questions about where the subject of belief is, the questions of the unconscious, it completely, it changes it around. So it's, and as you pointed out, that the whole point of Lacanian analysis is about an encounter, a transformation in the unconscious, a transforming in the way one speaks and the way one engages in the social bond. And the question of atheism, if someone says, I don't believe, I mean, like someone said to me that the questions of what atheism is, we shouldn't talk of atheism, we should talk of atheisms. So it's a question of how one believes, and we can invest in an atheism or a certain modality of talking about our atheism with all the tenacity of a fundamentalism, all the tenacity of a libidinal investment. And I think it's in one of the seminars that says it's very, very difficult. I forget the actual formulation of it. It's difficult to articulate one's unbelief because the very fact that one speaks means that there is an attesting to it a big other. I think it's in seminar 20, but I can't. Don't quote me on that. But it's the idea that if we're talking about the nature of belief or unbelief, we have to automatically bring in questions of the unconscious. But I think there's also I mean, what's interesting to me is the relationship of Lacan to sort of theologians that are like attested this, like people I've heard of, like Karl Rahner. He was a Heideggerian theologian, and he talks about the anonymous theist and the anonymous atheist. It's the anonymous atheist. The anonymous atheist is one who is a Christian, who has all, gives lip service he gives lip service to the fact that they believe in God and whatnot, but in their lived day-to-day life, that they live just as an atheist would. And then you've got the inverse. You've got the anonymous atheist, which is a person who might say they don't believe, but all of their actions and everything they do attest to a type of unconscious belief. And I think maybe there's something there that we can talk about. Yeah, and I think that either way, that's that's where I think there's a lot more to be said about theologians. I mean, Lacan was interested in sort of that French milieu of the ressourcement movement. People like Yves Congar, Anu de Leubach, and others, where we can see a type of mystical approach to theology, the analogia entis, where you can bring in questions of Hegelianism and its relationship to that as well, in talking about a deeper, more developed theology than the dry scholasticism that went before, and so therefore questions about the relationship to the unconscious, to belief as such, would have been really interesting. And that's what I think that this book is pretty much about, the triumph of religion and discourse to Catholics. You've read this? It's
yeah, I'm familiar with it. Yeah, I suppose there is several reasons for Lacan stating, almost in a prophetic way, or almost like as a kind of, well, he's making a commentary about a social commentary, right? He's saying something about the triumph of religion in our time. And that has many areas or angles by which we can study this phenomenon of the so-called return of religion, from the collapse, I would say, in a political, geopolitical context of the USSR, insofar as the destabilization that globalization brought about, especially in developing countries, politicized the sphere of religion in almost unprecedented ways. We know this all throughout Africa, the way that Christianity was invoked in different warfare. We know this in the Islamic faith as well. So there's this geopolitical return of religion. There is also the paradoxical fact of the flattening of cultural difference in the age of unipolar capitalism, of a kind of unipolar capitalist world system, and the collapse of the noumenal, the collapse of the spaces outside of that exchange relation of global capitalism also produces a certain disenchantment in a kind of Weberian sense, which itself foments a crisis of spirituality, which doesn't mean that people become less spiritual. It means that they become more spiritual in that alienation, right? So there's this way to look at it. But however, I think that Lacan is talking about it from a slightly different register, precisely because Lacan will argue that part of the reason that Jung was possible as an esoteric mysticist and irrationalist is also owed to the scientific renaissance that Freud ushers in vis-a-vis the unconscious. So if modern science and the discourse of modern science and the discourse of capitalism are eroding the efficacy of psychoanalysis, that actually portends, you see, something on the effects of man's belief, right? Because this is the meaning of Lacan's statement that today, writing in the 1970s, there is not a trace of initiation. What that actually means, in a certain way, is also a collapse in the authority structures of the capitalist institutions, starting with the family, but also extending out of the family. So there's also this decline of the paternal order and so on. So you see what I'm saying, Mark? There's these multiple levels of disarray, of disorder, right?
Mhm.
And this is why Lacan talks about, and Miller talks about, the disorder of the real.
Mhm.
And so you have to bring sociology and geopolitical analysis and political economic, and you have to bring all of these modes of analysis to understand why the subjectivity of our time is in such chaos. And
Right.
in that chaos, that is why religion returns in a
Mhm.
simple sense.
Well, I think that this is absolutely true, and I think that there's that simplistic reading, where people read Lacan and this idea. They go, "Oh well, the triumph, the true religion is going to he's good." It's and he talks about the saturation in meaning. That's the reason. Why does Catholicism? Why is Catholicism itself going to be victorious? Because it saturates, it secretes meaning on everything. Lacan says in the Discourse to Catholics. And there's this, people read this in a way to think that this means that it's a good thing, but it's not. He's talking about it in quite a negative way. But I think that there's a dual aspect, like you say. There's a dual aspect here where I think, and I think that this can only be, and this is what I was trying to signal just a second ago about the analogia entis, the idea that we have the positive and what we can call the cataphatic, which is secreting everything in meaning, and we have the limit, the apophatic, which is synonymous with a disruptive, antagonistic understanding, or which we can equate with the real. The real, as such, if you wish, is a limit. And I think what Lacan, is trying to get at, as you say, is that the triumph of religion is ultimately a bad thing, and it's absolutely the same as what you said about this disorder in the real, collapse in the logic of the all. Okay, it's a collapse in the logic of the all, the paternal order, and so we end up in what Miller calls the machine of the not all. Where everything is one by one a type of bad infinity, and everything becomes saturated in sorry, I've got the kids back here. They just come all in. Yeah, but you can hear them in the back of there. But you can see there's saturation in meaning. So the triumph of religion, in this sense, is synonymous, I think, with and I don't like this thing of making Lacan a type of prophet. But I think, as any analyst can see traces of things, maybe. I don't know. But there is this idea, what we can see now. And we see it very much, and you've written eloquently. And, there's an aspect of our own writing sort of mirroring each other. And I've referenced you in my book as well, in terms of, we're talking about this, about self-help culture and how that segues into, sort of fascist logics of disciplining of the body. And we can talk about various forms of spirituality, not as a type of encounter or a point of transformation, but of intense adaptation, a way of dealing with the collapse of paternal ordering, the collapse of the logics of the all, of demarcating ourselves, of finding our place in the symbolic, of lacking name, if you wish, and a way of being able to, adapt ourselves by secreting ourselves in various forms of meaning. And I think that, Lacan, signaled this. But I also think if you look in his other writings, like Seminar 20, he also understood that, there was also another side of the religious. There's another side of the apophatic. There's another side of what we can call the mystical. Yes, yes, we can see, a negative side to Catholicism, the way or religion as such, the way it secretes things in meaning. But there is also, a contradictory aspect of religion, which has a powerful feminine disruptive aspect. With people like John of the Cross, the feminine not all. We can see it, and Lacan takes that logic in Seminar 20. That idea of a disruptive form of subjectivity, and from there, from Seminar 20 to Seminar 23 onward, concepts like the synthome, la lingua, he develops these as being an integral part of the analytic process as such. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I mean, let's revisit a couple points that were raised. I mean, the first point that I think that has raises a red flag for any reader of Lacan, I think today especially, is this idea of the collapse of paternal authority and the collapse of this relationship to the all, or to the category of inclusion qua universal, or this idea that, well, if the father's authority is
I think
destabilized,
people end up
then,
reading this as a type of, that means everyone's psychotic, right? And that's,
well,
I don't.
there's several problems with it. That's one possible problem. There's others, though. The other, of course, is a kind of assumption that Lacanians wish to re-entrench and reinforce a politics of the stable father. And that, I think, I was just listening to a Verso Books interview with Andres Malm. And Andres Malm was said, have you ever read Lacan? And Andres Malm said, no, I refuse to read Lacan, because he was told, or he had a cursory impression of Lacan as putting forward a politics that was that vulgar, that like you have to have a strong father in any social order to stabilize that social order. And that is a misreading, because it would not explain the fact that so many feminists have gained really, really great insight from Lacan's theory about the decline of the paternal function, on the one hand. On the other hand, it positivizes the solution to something that is being pointed to as a diagnosis of a social phenomenon. So it misses prescription with diagnosis. You see the point?
Yeah, yeah.
It conflates them. Now, in some thinkers, prescription and diagnosis in political matters like are meant to be conflated if you have a reactionary thinker. This is why, like, when Lacan says capitalism foments relationships of segregation, he
Yep.
does not say any moral claim after that. No, he turns from that fact, for which he's talked about this as a division over the generation of man's relationship to surplus enjoyment in capitalism, and the privatization of that, and the fact that that privatization creates these communities of private enjoyment that accumulate it, and so on. And that foments a certain kind of racism, and so on. He's not celebrating that. There are many thinkers that would, and that's different. So you can read that and celebrate as a prescription for furthering something, but that's not what Lacan is doing.
Right. Yeah.
So I think there's that ethics that's always important to sort of keep a close reading of. And then, of course, okay, and then the other thing you talked about that I think is interesting is the notion of secretion. And so your understanding here is interesting, because on the one hand, religion has this secretion into all of the pockets and crevices of the social order, and envelops. It's almost smothers. It's almost very, you could say, phallic. Okay.
It is phallic. Yeah.
Yeah, it is phallic.
Phallus,
Okay.
fallacy, you know. So,
Okay. So there's that. But there's another form of religiosity, which is ascetic, and which deals with the other side of the phallic all. Because when we say all, we're talking about a logic of the phallus. And this is important because we're not talking about it in the sense of like penis envy as some kind of brute empirical fact. But Lacan argues that the order of the sensibility of the symbolic order of language is founded off of a relationship to the phallus. So maybe you could say something about this, because that's our best way for listeners that are struggling to understand Lacan to understand what we mean by the all.
well, I think, when we're talking about the logic of the all and the not all, there are like levels of understanding, and it's a specific logic that's brought out in Seminar 20. But the way I interpret, or the way I was reading it, is I was thinking specifically about the relationship, from my perspective, of different forms of theology and the relationship of God to creation as a way of being, as a heuristic to be able to talk about this. Now, back in the past, if you go back into the old scholastics of Christianity, there was a guy called Garrigou Lagrange, and he wasn't a great guy, and people, the trads would get upset with me with this, but he apart from his deeply reactionary politics, in France at the time, during the Second World War, he also was a big believer in a type of separation between nature and grace. Okay, big separation between nature and grace. Grace on one side, nature on the other. And then what happened is that later on you had, and this led up to sort of what we call consecular theology. And there was a general rejection of this type of neo-scholasticism, okay, where it saw a too big a division between grace on one side and nature on the other. And you had theologians like Yves Congar, Hans von Balthasar, Henri de Lubac, and others. And these guys were known as ressourcement theologians. And also Teilhard de Chardin as well, who Lacan knew. He knew him, and there's a famous picture of them together. And apparently the story goes that Lacan made Teilhard de Chardin cry because he said to him that angels actually exist. He said something poetic to him, and Teilhard de Chardin, being the overly sensitive Jesuit, he started crying, apparently. But the point that these guys were trying to get at is that this separation between nature and grace, it's not that the nature, the supernatural fulfills the natural. This gap between nature and the supernatural is not as separate as these neo-scholastics would like to think. It's more of a Borromean knot. Sorry, no, it's more of a torus. So it's more of a, it's not as separate as what we think it is. It's not monism, okay? It's not a monistic concept. It's not pantheism, but neither is it directly equivocal, okay? There is a rapport. There is a relation, but it's not a direct relation, okay? It's not a direct relation. Now you can see what I'm trying to articulate here is that my conception of the non-rapport in Seminar 20, I believe, has an analogous relationship to some of this theology of unity in difference. It's not exactly the same, but it can't be, because it's shorn of questions of ontology. It's for instance, at a very basic theological level, there is a theology of being in Catholicism, when Lacan is very much on the side of a henology. There is no such thing as a sexual rapport. The inverse of that is there is something of the one, okay? But the one is not an ontology, it's a henology. It's, as Millar talks about it, the real, it doesn't palpate. So it's important not to think, well, Lacan is directly speaking about this stuff. It's not. There's an analogous relationship. So if you have people like, I'd say, certain psychoanalysts who had an equivocal understanding of the unconscious with consciousness, where there's almost a complete separation between conscious and consciousness, and then you've got pantheistic conceptions of of unconscious and conscious, where we have like people like Jung, who talks about individuation, integration. Well, with Lacan, you've got something a bit different. You've got a unity in difference. You've got there's a non-rapport and a non-relation to the unconscious. But at the same time, this non-rapport goes all the way down. It relates to our relation to the sexes as well, and the logic that applies to that. And I think that there is something in that logic specifically that's lifted, or not lifted, reinterpreted maybe a parasitical reading of it. I don't know. But it's this idea of a type of reading, of a mystical reading that applies to it. But it's not a mystical reading in the sense of a Jungian one. It's disruptive. And well, I'll talk a little bit more about that when I come to my book. But does that explain a little bit?
Yeah, it does. I think this gives people a good sense of what Mark is really articulating, as far as I can tell here, is the notions that for theologians, Lacan opens up this arsenal or treasure box, let's say, of these different ways to think about categories that are already on the docket of theological reflection, from belief to the status of the one, to the relationship and the distinction between different spheres of reality. I mean, you name it, Lacan offers these points of parallel or sort of analogous reflection.
Yeah.
And that's actually that draws us now to I wanted to start off with giving folks a feel for Lacan and spirituality, Lacan and theology. And tell us now, Mark, about your book with the Paul Grave Lacan series on spiritual direction. Perhaps you might start by defining what spiritual direction is first.
Okay, so I start off with a quote. A spiritual direction is a discipline that goes right the way back to the Desert Fathers. You know, we're going back to like 6th century or whatever. It's a tradition, and I think it's a tradition that's that you find in most religions, whether it's Sufism or Islam and the Sufi tradition, Catholicism, Protestantism. But it's an idea of seeking out guidance for a deepening in one's spiritual life, a deepening of one's prayer life, a way of seeking guidance to develop what we can call one's relationship with the divine. And obviously in a Catholic Christian idiom, it's about deepening one's relationship and one's encounter with Christ. Now, if in more of a Protestant tradition, that'll be more word-based, maybe more pneumatic. In a Catholic, it'll be more sacramentally orientated, with with a more ecclesial aspect, maybe more reference to institutional norms as well. But my book came about, and it's sort of, I think when most people write a book on some level, the first book, there's an aspect of a type of biography, or a type of trying to insert yourself in it. It's a question that concerns you. And when I was younger, I was a bit of a spiritual seeker and went around various places and trying to figure out things. And a big question for me, and I think it was about seeking God, and seeking God in my own life became synonymous with a kind of seeking out healing, a type of therapeuticism, equating God with a type of healing band-aid, and also a type of experience. The idea that when you find God, there will be a type of thing that you can grasp and you will get and you understand, and there will be certainty and everything will be okay. The more you sought, the less it was there. It wasn't there. And this journey led me. Well, I sort of went away from my own family. I was born a Catholic. I was raised a Catholic, and then I went away, went searching various disciplines and spiritualities, and then came back to it. But what came back is when I was undergoing catechesis and spiritual direction with an old priest in Liverpool named Godfrey Carney. And he was ancient when I met him. He was like 80 odd and 90 odd. He was like incredibly old, Irish, been there for years. And I said to him, earnestly, I've never had an experience of God. I've never felt God move in my life. And he goes, well, what do you need an experience for? He says in this sort of broad way. And then you realize that maybe the way I'm understanding this and what he showed me is going back into is that with Catholicism, is that it's not just about, faith seeking an experience. It's faith seeking understanding. It's this idea that we're not talking about a specific experience of God, but we're looking at the whole of human experience as such. The idea is that we are not human beings seeking out a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And that includes very much everything of our lives, including aspects of destitution, including kenosis, the cross. And so that, led me to sort of reading, I thank Father Carney, really, because he was the one that introduced me to philosophy proper as a kid. He got me reading Aristotle, he got me reading Aquinas, but he also introduced me to the mystics. He introduced me to sort of John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, and others. Something I'd never encountered anywhere. This language of speaking of God as darkness, as a lack of experience. And so eventually, to cut a long story, I ended up going to St. Mary's, and I did my first thesis on spirituality and questions of addiction. It was in my master's, and let's say, and then this sort of led, and then I stepped away for a while. I worked in a pastoral center, sort of doing catechetical work and spiritual work myself. And then I moved over, and then I went back and took a doctorate at St. Mary's under the tutelage of Professor Peter Tyler. And what happened then is I started revisiting this stuff. And I started doing research into psychology, but not only that, reflecting on my own experience in psychoanalysis. Okay, and this is interesting because I when I started doing the research on spiritual direction and Lacan, I was like floundering around a bit, and then I went to these conferences. Every single conference I went to with regards to looking at questions of spiritual direction and psychology, and all spiritual directives and questions of pastoral theology and Catholicism, they're all geared towards a specific style of psychology. It's all humanistic psychology. It's all Jungian psychology, and it all works on this heuristic and interpretation of everything has to start with experience. I remember going to a conference, and I said, "Oh, I'm doing my work on John of the Cross and psychoanalysis." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Which psychoanalyst are you doing it on?" I said, "I'm doing it on Lacan." And they said, "Oh, I'm not a philosopher." So it's like, oh, that's interesting, because there is this reception of Lacan in the Anglosphere that he's not a psychoanalyst to be taken seriously. Well, if he's taken seriously, he's taken at the level of philosophical theology as such, maybe, and even then it wouldn't be receptive in the more Anglo-analytic fields of philosophy of religion, or what you call analytic theology in America. But it would be philosophical theology. There is no such thing as Lacan in pastoral theology. Okay, I wanted to break through and show Lacan as a serious clinician, the same way as Jung is a serious clinician, the same way James Hillman is a serious clinician, the same way Bion is a serious clinician. Okay. These people are all incredibly important. It's an important toolbox for the spiritual director, because
got it. And what does Lacan give to the trainee of somebody? Because a spiritual director is somebody that it's like a function that will exist within spiritual and religious communities. Yes. across the board. It's not reducible just to Catholicism.
Exactly.
So within that, they're kind of like they're not exactly like a chaplain, but they have kind of like a chaplain and a self-help.
It depends. You can have you'll find people like chaplains, or people in priests, or people or just people who are lay. It's a practice within a tradition. So you'll have priests. A priest friend of mine, who's a student of mine, and he wrote a great essay about how spiritual direction appears in unexpected places. So, say for instance, in the confessional, confession is not spiritual direction. Okay, so people go to confession as a sacrament, but within the confessional, there will be moments where spiritual direction happens. Okay, so it will happen
I
within the
get it. I get it. It's
confessional.
quite
Okay,
broad. Yeah. So then, if you were to be in front of a panel of critics that are experts in spiritual direction, what are two things that you would say that the Lacanian methodology offers to spiritual direction to convince this panel?
well, I think to convince this panel is I think he allows a return to what spiritual direction was. Lacan was very much about the idea of a return to Freud. Now we know a return to Freud is not a fundamentalist return to Freud. The same way that what we have with spiritual, with what I believe with Lacan, there is no such thing as a spiritual director who isn't really trained in psychology. But I think the problem that we have today is that the types of psychology that we have change the very orientation of what spiritual direction is as such. It turns it into an extension of psychology. It turns it into a healing discourse, one of a type of truncated therapeuticism, the idea that we're all seeking an experience of God that we can have. And I think that what Lacan does is he reminds us that if you go back and read people like John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, these guys weren't talking about a specific experience. In many ways, it's a critique of experience as such. And so I think Lacan allows the directors to be able to rediscover that without throwing psychology or psychoanalysis out the window, precisely because Lacan was critical of those things himself, which I believe he took from the mystical tradition. And I'll talk about this in a second. So there's two things on critique of experience. Okay? In John of the Cross, you read his writings. He was very, very aware of his directees or students seeking out an experience of God or seeking out an experience of divine. And he basically warned students off against the danger. He warns them about the danger of seeking out extraordinary religious experiences. And he was basically, very, very careful in schooling the students and saying what you're undergoing as you're, deepening in your prayer life won't be what you expect it to be. The Holy Spirit moves in unexpected ways, and in many ways it's going to be a type of destitution, an emptying out of experience. You are going to undergo a type of spiritual desert, what he calls the dark night. And so there's two things that you see in John of the Cross. One is an expectation in methodology, where he's saying, do not seek out experience. But also, he's also very, very careful in seeing what he calls the dark night. He's making sure that students don't see that as a type of dark experience or dark goal, a sublime experience in and of itself. It's not. It's an emptying out of experience. And I believe that you see something similar in Lacan. I think that you see something very similar in Lacan, the critique of ego psychology, the idea of the critique of, do not give in to the imaginary, do not give in to demand as such. Okay,
that's a really beautiful point. I just want to say something about that. If I was in the panel, I would be lifting my eyebrows. I mean, I would be curious as to what you say there, because I think that's the heart of Lacan's contribution, in my opinion. Because if the model is this humanistic psychology one, the all or the fullness of the ego is almost theorized as the site for resolution of the almost as like is that which satiates the conflicts of the given subject that you're dealing with. But Lacan offers a rebuke to that presupposition, because Lacan has a theory of the imaginary, which argues that the full realization of the subject's experience can also foment a certain type of imaginary aggression that has to be worked through. So it's almost not to say that Lacanian psychoanalysis is uninterested in the wholeness of the human. I think that it is, but I think it's more critical about extending that further, because you could read Lacan in a vulgar way by saying it's almost like a kind of austere Buddhism, right? Where it's this, and austere Buddhism is not for everyone, right? But I think that I want you to say more about that theory of lack that Lacan has is more rigorous, but its end result is not the development of a kind of cold and bleak subject who is like beyond all attachments or something. That's not exactly the end result. If anything, the end result is to shift the unconscious keywords, because Lacan develops a structural theory of language in relationship to the unconscious, in which when you do analysis, one of the first things you realize, really before you go to the couch, before you start analytic exchange where you're not looking at the analyst, where the unconscious stuff really begins to work in free association, right? Well, before all of that, the analyst needs to be able to pinpoint certain words that repeat in your speech, yeah? And those are your keywords, okay? And those latch onto unconscious processes of repetition and drive repetition that have to be rerouted and reorganized. That is the work of free association, to loosen those signifiers. That's the task of psychoanalysis. That's the task of the free association method, to loosen those heavy signifiers. Like, for example, in my own analysis, I know my keywords, right? I know my keywords. I know the words that are linked to my familial traumas of the past. And it's a good knowledge to have, but it's not enough, because the next step is to interrogate them and to, in some sense, reassign them, to engage in an experiment with their unmooring. You have to unmoor them. You see?
Yeah.
So that's the adventure of psychoanalysis. And the unmooring of that is a negative process, but the result of that is, well, in some sense, it's a reinvention of one's own singularity, right? Because it's quite profound.
It is very profound. Can I just say something? So when I wrote this book, is very much, and if you read like Millar's work and whatnot, what I do like, reading Millar's work, is that he gives an overview of the development of Lacanian thinking. And while I wrote this in a specific at a specific juncture in Lacan's writing, and it is to do about constitutive negativity, and it is to do about desire. It's right there in the title. This one is a question of desire, but there is another side of Lacan, and it is about the limits of analysis. And it is that these limits aren't necessarily, something hard, fast, and it means that we need to step away and walk away from it. No, these are, to use a Sartrean idiom, it's to do with facticity. These limits that we hit in are about a certain inventiveness that we have to be able to approach. And we can see it in Lacan's own writings. He constantly realized he comes up against certain problems in analysis, problems that, to do with the approach of seeing analysis solely as a process of the signifier, a process of desire. The idea of seeing the end of analysis as a type of disinvestment of jouissance. And he became with these problems. So later on, and you see it in the later work of Lacan, is that inventiveness that you are talking about in analysis as such, he applies almost in a type of dialectical way to analysis as such, the school as such. And yes, if you can sort of see part of Lacan's writings, or middle Lacan, if you wish, as more apophatic, as more kenotic, as more of a type of emptiness, you can see that within the later Lacan there is a type of positivity, right, where the language shifts, where it becomes about la langue, about stuff. But I think it's important, where I think that the problem still persists, and I think that a lot of people, especially in the Catholic tradition and those dealing with mystical theology, end up interpreting questions of desire in an effective way. I think the danger is even more so there in the later Lacan, because it's talking about enjoyment, about jouissance, about positive, and so there's more danger of taking this stuff and seeing it purely in terms of a type of effectivism. And I don't think that that's what Lacan was talking about. You can see it in Marie-Hélène Bruch's work. It's even more negative in a sense.
I think the danger, or the question that always haunts and now if we were to switch our panel and you were to address your plea for the unification of Lacan and spiritual direction to a panel of psychoanalysts, one of the responses they might say, Mark, I think, would be the common issue, which is, well, you have to sort of create the conditions for free association to take place, because, when the art of listening is not a narrativistic art of listening. Like, that's what we normally think of listening. Like, you pay attention to the story and you retell it, and the greater degree of accuracy that you retell it, that's a sign of your listening strengths and skills, right? That's not the sign of listening for the psychoanalyst.
Exactly. Yep.
The sign of listening for the psychoanalyst is different, but it's different on condition that the subject they're listening to is in a state where they are permitted to enter into free association. And that is why the transference is so important in a basic sense, because it's a basic notion of a trust, of a transfer of onto another, and so that the free association can occur. Now, in a relationship of spiritual direction, right? How, this would be a question for you, would you conceptualize, right, the creation of a space where free association can take place? Because I think that is, pretty essential. Your thoughts?
So I think it's the larger question I think that this takes place is the direct relationship of what is the difference between the clinical space and the space of spiritual direction. And I think this is a perennial question that goes in, and it shows a larger issue at stake. And I think a subtext of this thesis that I wrote is about how we maintain the difference. We maintain the difference between the clinical and that of spiritual direction. And I wrote this book from the position of spiritual direction. Okay, so it's a question of I am trying to say that the space of spiritual direction can only be maintained if, I'm going to use theological terms here directly from John of the Cross, if there is space for the Holy Spirit to work. And that means that we can't impose ourselves onto the directee. Okay, it's there. If a person comes to spiritual direction, there always has to be space for what we call the pneumatic element, not in a type of effective understanding of it, but in this idea of an absolute space where a person's speech can reveal or open up where they think God is or the divine is working in their life. But, and I think that this is where Lacan really gives us a tool, and that's the key point. It's a tool. It's a heuristic. It's not a heuristic, but it's a way of. It's a tool that can be utilized in spiritual direction that gives people a different ear, a third ear, if you wish, as Bruce Fink would say. Okay, it allows something that it allows a way of being able. Because don't forget, in theology, there's been massive amounts of what we call narrative theology. Okay, we know this sort of narrative theology, the linguistic turn, loads of it. But again, and we're circling back to what we were talking about a second ago, it's secreted in meaning. Narrative, telling a story. Oh, spiritual direction is about listening to the person's story, okay? And then finding yourself in that narrative and linking yourself into a wider meta-narrative. That in itself can become harmful, especially when we know this. We know it can be harmful. At the level of the imaginary, what happens if the narrative falls apart? Okay? The whole point, I think, that Lacan does is he shows the limits of narrative. He shows the limits of narrative whilst not undermining the place of the signifier. Okay? And that means a whole different way of listening. Yes, it does mean listening to a person's story, but it also means listening to that which interrupts the story. What does Lacan say in Seminar 5, which is the object relation? What does he say? The Holy Spirit is the signifier breaking into the world. He says. Now, I'm not saying that there's it is the Holy Spirit. We can talk about an analogous relation. Okay, but I'm saying that there is a different modality of listening that I think that Lacan offers to spiritual directors, because it's at the end of the day, and I think that there's an important thing here, and part of the work that I was trying to do is that there are two Lacans. We have the philosophical Lacan of the Anglosphere. Okay, we have who's taught in various humanities departments, who's taught in critical theory, who's taught in what we call continental philosophy. He's certainly not taught in analytic philosophy departments. Okay?
Not yet.
Not yet.
He could be very easily.
It could be very easily, but we can see that
those analytics, they can eat any philosopher up and incorporate them.
We're seeing. We can talk that there's a whole thing at the moment in analytic philosophy, the social movement or something, which is ultimately them trying to become hyper politically relevant, but in a Anglo analytic idiom. But I digress. The point is that Lacan is massively popular, across in those departments. But as a clinician, he's not. It's difficult in the Anglo. I think he's more popular in America and Canada, but in England we've got CFAR and we've got the NLS. And I can't think off the top if there's anything beyond that in terms of clinical practice. And my point is that Lacan really, when it comes down to it, if we're talking about it as a practice, it's not so much about a body of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It's a practice. It's a practice of listening, to an extent of speaking, intervening, and it's one of transformation. It's one of transformation, a transformation of subjectivity of subjectivity. If you're talking about the middle Lacan, it's about the parlet, the speaking being in the later Lacan. But ultimately, for me, that type of transformation comes from a discipline and practice of listening and speaking. But it's not speaking and listening that is ultimately tied up in a sort of flattened out idea of narrative, story. It's something that's interruptive of that. But at the same time, it's not something, and I think that this is one of the problems I have with mystical theology, is that, we've got the limit of narrative, we've got the limit of story, we've got the limit of intellect. Well, what does that mean? It means that we're talking about feelings, we're talking about the effect. No, No. I think that that's wrong. I think that what if you read the mystical theology of John of the Cross, especially, and others, yes, the limits, or that point where we run up against the limits, it's about the intellect, but it's also about the effect as well. It's in something that interrupts all aspects of ourselves, a dissolution of subjectivity, to the extent that it can be, reconfigured, or to use theological terms, to be resurrected. It's that level that we're talking about, and I think that that's what's so important about Lacan's concept of the real. And I think the real, and I think one of the greatest philosophers, and I agree with you on this, in talking about that, is Badiou. I think Badiou basically, and he's that book on St. Paul. I remember reading it years and years ago. It was astounding.
Mm-hmm. I agree. All right, Mark, you've done an excellent job in your 2 panels that I've given you here of assessing the relevance of Lacan for this particular mode. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, I hope folks that are listening to this who are either engaged in some kind of spiritual practice, I'm sure that they will benefit from listening to what you say, as well as folks who are maybe spiritual but have no interest in the vocation of following.
I mean,
that further.
I come with my, I'm a theologian, a philosophical theologian, and I'm writing from a theological perspective. And there is this aspect of Lacan, where he's, as you pointed out at the very beginning, he was someone who wanted a return to Freud. He was an analyst first and foremost, but at the same time he reached out and had his fingers in lots of different pies. He was interdisciplinary, and I think one of the greatest homages that we have to Lacan as a great thinker is that you have many different disciplines writing from him. I'm a theologian, you're a philosopher. You have people writing from lots of different perspectives, finding something within of value within his work that can bring it. And for me, it's an important, every single spiritual director I've been to, or any pastoral theologian, there's always been a big interest in the role of, say, given theologies and its relation to psychology. But I just noticed there was a huge gap where Lacan just wasn't there at all. But then you went to sort of philosophical theology, and those that write more from the continental tradition, and Lacan's right there. Tina Beatty's written a great book on Marcus Pound, right? But there's nothing there at the level of pastoral theology. And I wanted to be able to show that Lacan, as a clinician, has something of real import, no pun intended, real import for the practice, the pastoral practice of what we call spiritual direction. He allows us to be able to see spirituality, spiritual direction, as a practice linked to the mystical theologians. We should, and Lacan allows us to approach that in a different way than, say, how we rely on people like Carl Jung or Bion and I like, but it's and others. He allows us to be able to see. He allows us to return to the mystics the same way as Lacan return to Freud.
Sure. What are a couple books by Lacan for folks that want to learn more about his work in this regard? You've already mentioned The Triumph of Religion. Yep. Perhaps you might mention a couple other works by Lacan too.
I think what to call it, it's the same one as like just the Discourse to Catholics, which is in the same book, Seminar 20. But there's also, I think it's Seminar 3. You can see that he talks about John of the Cross. But I will go away and double check that for you. But as you're reading Lacan's writings, you'll find that they're peppered right the way through. But there's also I've got give me a second. I will tell you now. But it's in the where he specifically talks about spiritual direction. It's in the Acli. And just give me a second. He says it well, I can dig it out the quote here, but I can't. It's at the back of the Acree. But he says that, and very, very clear. I can remember the quote in my head. He says, for a long time, psychoanalysts have looked at spiritual, have explored spiritual direction with a spyglass, and he says that we need to not do that. We need to be able to explore the practice of spiritual direction, in a better way. He says it, but I'll dig up the quote where he says that it's in my work anyway. But he says it specifically. He's referencing the practice of spiritual direction. And I also think if you're reading the later seminars, say seminar 23 and onwards, the development of the question of the non-rapport, that basically develops out into the synthome. But what's interesting is that in the later, the question of the synthome, it sort of becomes trapped, as a type of inward. He critiques. Joyce said, yes, it does work as a solution, this sort of self-naming for those who have a generalized foreclosure thing. But the problem is that there is no way of being able to encounter love, he says. And so there is and needs to be a way of being able to reach out from this, outwards. And so there's a development of the mystical, that you can see, formulating as the feminine in Seminar 20 from 2020 onwards, where it sort of reaches out into the analytic process as a practice of love. It's as Freud said. So it's you can see it from there. Although those seminars themselves, they're not easy reading, because he becomes much more baroque.
Well, that's fine. Yeah. I mean, I think for folks listening, I think it's pretty evident for the reason why people have a passionate attachment to Lacan usually revolves around the fact that when you undergo Lacanian psychoanalysis, you find it so deeply transformative for your personal life that simultaneous to that, you're reading all of his ideas in his seminars, which are very accessible. As Gabriel Tupanamba and I recently did, recently, a couple of years ago, actually, a book review of Jean-Claude Milner's The Clear Oeuvre, the clear work of Lacan.
Oh, this is the science book, is it?
Correct. Yeah, that book really shows, I think, quite accurately, that Lacan's not. Lacan always aimed for clarity. The immensity of the complexity, that's something different. So it's a life's work to read Lacan, and there is a certain invitation to have set he sets a very high bar of mastery of his work, but that doesn't mean that it is impenetrable. It means that you have a lot of work to do in deciphering it. So it's always refreshing, Mark, when you can do these kind of interventions in a practical field. I think that's quite valuable. So I want to congratulate you on the book, and I hope that it is used by spiritual directors.
I hope it makes all I want is for people to at least start the conversation. At least there's hardly any work out there at all on Lacan being utilized as a tool within spiritual direction to develop certain listening, a certain way of being able to approach questions of the spiritual that take it out of a hypertherapeutic culture. And that's something I wanted to be able to talk about what your own work. You are critical in your own work of what we can call self-help culture, okay, and how that segues into larger political problems. And I think, what we're seeing now is what I was initially seeing, and I think within certain aspects of Christian culture, that it worked as a type of microcosm. Every time I went to a spirit, you could see this sort of self-help culture that was everywhere. This idea of adaptation, this idea of seeking out an experience, the idea that God will heal you, that you need to just do X, Y, and Z, and everything will be fine. It was there already years ago. And now I think that what we're seeing is a type of spreading out of this everywhere. There is a saturation of it
Well,
everywhere. And
yeah, I mean, I've changed my mind in recent years regarding my assessment of self-help, especially after doing much more reading in the sociology of class. Because, there's something different about the post-war social order when we had a broader welfare state, which allowed for a certain stability of familial and individual becoming, which was far less precarious than it is today. And so in precarious times of crisis driven by global pandemics and the fear of a futureless society, the end of society, the end of the world, the unknown dimension, the existence of normalized genocide by the ruling class who disavows class entirely, who don't see themselves as a ruling class, who don't see power that way, who insist that power is some other racialized fantasy that it's not, right?
Cult of
That's the
passive
world we live in. That's the world we live in, yeah? And so in that world, yeah, that's much different than the world of Lacan in the 1970s. It's a night and day difference. It's night and day difference. In the category of the future was open. Our future is not open.
Yeah.
In that context, something like self-help was a cheap, instrumentalized, you could think Frankfurt School culture industry style of fake authenticity, right? That doesn't matter to me anymore. Why? The stakes are too high, especially for millennial age working class people. So what we see is a different use of self-help and therapeutic modalities that is more real, that is trying to wrestle with more real forms of psychological trauma and abuse that people have experienced in their own interpersonal lives, especially amongst the working class. And that creates a schism, therefore, between a kind of cheapened self-help that does exist, and which is kind of libertarian and market-driven, and like Byung-Chul Han writes about, right? That kind of false positivity, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
That's fine, but that presupposes that the consumer cannot escape that reality. My claim would be that in most cases, actually, we should see people seeking out those modalities as already aware of that internal instrumentalization of self-help, and therefore capable of transcending it. And therefore, when you see it that way, you see the turn to the therapeutic, right, much differently, right? So I would have to bracket it that way, Mark. Does that make sense to you?
No, it's this idea of a type of the instrumentalization of a modality of the therapeutic points to something. It points to a transformative encounter beyond that.
Correct.
Okay, so we can talk about
it points to in a desire for an encounter that is transformative in some cases, but it also points to the fact that people are being transformed. I don't think that we should presuppose that the therapeutic is somehow a failure across the board, or no, the issue is one of access and distribution and the limited basis of the money exchange and the fact that people cannot afford for the time and the leisure to engage in the forms of the therapeutic.
Right.
But still, they are at work and they're listening about it. They're immersing themselves into it. So that is not fomenting a narcissism epidemic vis-a-vis the therapeutic apparatus, as we thought in the 70s and 80s and so on, in the culture of the self and so on. No, I'm sorry, but after the invention of the iPhone in like 2006 and 7, I don't think that these notions of a narcissistic epidemic make any sense anymore.
No,
because
I think
in a sense, we've already transcended that. Not in some sort of AI positivistic, like transcendence. No, I mean that they've become more pernicious. But in becoming more pernicious, my claim would be we are witnessing a different backlash for at the level of need, right? At the level of addressing real psychological traumatic needs that
Yes.
is also happening. And so I don't really care about CIA funded Frankfurt School philosophers telling me that therapy is inauthentic. I don't think that that really is useful anymore, right? Like this Adorno line. I don't give a
Yeah.
shit about that. No, that's not the reality of true antagonism that people experience, right? And so I'm more interested in the therapeutic in that way. And I think that actually aligns with spiritual direction,
Yeah.
because the spiritual direction also has that uh, presupposition that the person being directed is there on the basis, and this kind of goes back to our first point about belief, but they're there because they have an intention.
Mhm.
You could say sincerity, but I'm not interested in that concept exactly. But there's something authentic in what they are doing. There's
No, no, I
something real.
I completely and 100% agree with you, and I do like that the invention of the iPhone and this is something I've been trying to articulate and I'm sure you'll find the same the struggle of there seems to be three intersecting elements. You've got like aspects of what we can call self-help culture, the therapeutic, whatever you want to call it, the spiritual, technology, and these are operate as a type of singularity. They're sort of contracting, pulling together. Where what's changed? It's changed so dramatically, precisely because of the way we communicate. The social bond as such has changed. We don't speak as much as we used to. Speaking as a predicate, a necessary predicate of the social bond, has been lessened. We still speak, obviously, but we write more now. We write more now than we speak, as we are written. We're on the phone, and for whatever reason, Lacan, and I think I remember. Right, the question, I think he calls it the gadget, the latouche, the this is Freud as well, the prosthetic god. And I think the question of throwing out the therapeutic as such. I prefer to talk about the analytic, but I think that the therapeutic is to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's the same logic that we have with fundamentalism as such. It's synonymous with a type of faith-driven discourse that wants to cut off philosophy from faith. It's just as dangerous to cut off the therapeutic from our way of being able to talk about suffering in this world. And yes, I do think that there is something very, very important about Lacanian analysis and Freudianism as such. Yes, it has the radical transformative aspect of relating itself to Marxist politics as such, but it also operates as a way of interrupting the bombastic claims of a type of hyper commodified therapeutic culture that promises the world and promises everything while giving us nothing. It allows us to be able to talk about the place of ordinary suffering as a modality of solidarity with others.
Yeah,
Does that make
that
sense?
makes sense. Yeah, it does. It does. Now this is good. I think, Mark, we will wrap our conversation for now, but on the condition that we continue it in the future.
Yeah.
This has been very interesting. I hope folks get a good feel for some of the kind of contours of the basics of Lacan's relationship to theology, spirituality, and religion in this conversation. Hopefully, you've gotten a good reading list at the minimum. And on that
I'd
reading
also,
list,
for some secondary work, check out Marcus Pound's work as well. Marcus Pound, he's written a good book on
yes, yes,
Lacan. It's an older work, and he's part of. I think you've got like several generations. He's the generation that came out with, Zizek and
uh-huh,
Monstrosity of Christ, and now
right,
we're
right.
um,
That's good.
so it's in Marcus Pound's
Fabulous.
work, very good. But I say
Wonderful,
thank
Mark.
you. And
All the best, my friend. I wish you all the best and a good new year. And
You
thanks for
too,
coming on the show.
and
Appreciate it very
congratulations.
much.
I know I talk very fast at the beginning. I get nervous at the beginning of interviews, but just edit it as you see fit. And then once I get into the flow, I'm okay.